this is a pretty pivotal moment in American history. You know, this 1960, the Reconstruction, and the import of that for, as you point out, not just recently emancipated, you know, Americans, but all America. So to put it in context, Dr. Barna, thank you for being here. Delighted that you are participating in sort of this, we call it the room where it happened kind of conversation. That as we talk about the Defining Fathers Legacy series, where we, with IPPH, look at three outsized personalities who had such an impact on Washington, D.C., becoming, instead of this backwater venue, a significant metropolis. And all of that's attached to this inflection point in American history, the Civil War, emancipation, and then really with Ulysses Grant, it's more about Reconstruction. Abraham Lincoln, because of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass as the real one, not the only one, but a very significant one, who pushed emancipation as being the central focal point of this Civil War. And then Ulysses Grant, without whom there would be no Reconstruction. And when he left, there was no Reconstruction.
Right.
But, you know, I'm a student of, I'm like some other people we know, I'm a graduate of Howard University.
All right.
Member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. And I was actually born in a hospital that was still called Freedmen's Hospital. So I, as a Washingtonian, I really know particularly the impact of that period, Freedmen's Hospital, Howard University, all of that, a byproduct of that era. But, you know, even I'd have to say, had a very narrow notion of the import of that, as thinking only in terms of formerly enslaved people now emancipated, da 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 da. But what I'd like to talk with you about is your scholarship around how this period is such a meaningful, defining period in terms of notions of citizenship. Mm-hmm. You know, for all Americans. And rather than not me just doing this talking here, how about you begin to give me the first few sentences that we can have this conversation?
Yeah. So my work is primarily, my scholarship to this point has primarily been about free African American communities and the ways that those communities developed and tried to produce change, both for themselves and for the country in the decades before the Civil War. And I think one of the things that, you know, probably isn't surprising to folks like you or folks who know a bit about African American history, but is surprising to, I think, many people in the larger American public is just the fact that there were significant and vocal minorities of free African Americans before the ending of slavery. This is one of the sort of fundamental realities of these folks' lives, is that they're living as this kind of small, very small, but very vocal and very significant minority group in the decades before the ending of slavery with the 13th Amendment. And so part of what I'm really interested in and what I've been interested in is like how these folks, how free African Americans in places like New York and Philadelphia and other parts of the North, how did they try to confront the realities that they were free and Black, but they were restricted, they were constrained, their freedom was limited in a lot of really profound ways. And so what I've argued and what I've seen is that they looked at citizenship as a device, as an object. Citizenship essentially was undefined in the United States before the Reconstruction Amendments, before the 14th Amendment. It wasn't clear who was a citizen. It wasn't clear what rights the status entailed. It wasn't clear how a person had access to the status. But it was sort of increasingly clear that citizenship was important, that it was a way to link individuals with a set of rights, that it was a way to sort of describe a relationship between an individual and the government. And so what I've found is that these free African Americans, free and constrained, that they used citizenship to try to break through those constraints, that they said, we are citizens and therefore we should have X, Y, and Z rights. We should be able to sit on juries. We should be able to vote. We should be able to serve in militias. And so they tried to claim citizenship for themselves. And in the process, they tried to basically use it to enrich their status and change the legal position that they occupied in the country.
Well, when you think about it, and we're thinking about it more here at IPPH, this whole notion of the United States of America, we the people, was such a radical, unprecedented notion.
Mm.
And therefore, not surprisingly, not that well defined with the creation of the country. So, I mean, when George Washington occupied the office of president, what was that? I mean, he had to literally flesh it out.
Mm-hmm.
James Madison was the principal architect, but not the only architect of that Constitution, an imperfect document for certain. But all of this was just taken out of whole cloth.
Yeah.
And so, and you also think about how the notion of who even had the right to vote, which we eventually, and thanks to, I think, this community of Black leaders in particular, give great focus to the importance of the right to vote, is a static notion. Basically, it's white men, generally white men with property. Not that notion is never touched. That notion is never built upon, edited, or anything until, what is it, 1868 with the 15th Amendment.
Mm.
And so, this is suddenly this radical idea of 17, I guess, ratified in 1788, is beginning to take life. And then even the Civil War, you could argue, and I'm doing all of those, is questioning that radical idea. I mean, 11 of the states are saying, I'm out of here. I mean, hey,
Yeah.
what's with this United States of America? We're gone.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting to think about that. I think that I'm thinking about a couple of things. There's a scholarly organization that I think is really has been really productive in terms of rethinking this period, the early United States. It's called Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And part of what's interesting about that is that it sort of began in a lot of ways as an organization that focused on like the period from the revolution to about the 1820s. And increasingly, their chronology has gotten longer, and they recognize themselves as sort of covering the revolution to the Civil War era. And the argument there is essentially that the republic is new, that it's forming, that things are in flux, and by nature, then things are unstable for decades, for 7 or 8 decades in between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And that's an idea that's at the heart of my book. Essentially, I like to think of the activists who I write about as part of this group of people who were Black and white Americans who were contesting the terms of the founding. And the basically like trying to reframe or rethink the Constitution and its fundamental principles. And that work was happening, as you suggest, it was happening all the way up through the Civil War. The major outcome of the U.S. Civil War was the emancipation of 4 million enslaved African Americans, the creation of freedom for those people. The question of that moment was, what does freedom actually mean? And that question was embedded in, that question was essential to the United States from the time of its founding. And so these issues, these questions of freedom, of belonging, of the precise relationship between individuals and the government, all these things are being negotiated across that entire period of decades, up to and up through the era of Reconstruction. I think it's really critical to recognize that the nation was barely formed when the Constitution was ratified. And so that opens up a lot of avenues for us to think about, okay, well, who was taking part in the conversations that formed it? Who was contributing to the shaping of the U.S.?
And I mean, you can understand how, I mean, you know, they were just sort of, they knew they were upset with Britain and they declared themselves independent of Britain in 1776. And only because this collaboration of, you know, of colonies and states couldn't function, that prompted them to have this constitution and come up with this. But I mean, we've been there. I mean, even with the District of Columbia, we didn't come about until 1974.
Mm.
And so even though you have templates for it, you're still kind of working it out while you're trying to implement it.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Yeah.
you get why.
Making a government is a process. It's a long
Yeah.
process. Yeah.
Yeah. So everyone knows of, you know, Frederick Douglass as sort of a towering figure of this time. There are others I know you talk about. You want to elaborate on a few of them that you think are important?
Yeah, so one of the people, I guess I would tell maybe two stories about two related figures, two Black New Yorkers, Black newspaper editors operating in like the 1820s and 1830s. The first is a man named John Russwurm, and Russwurm is kind of like the starting point for my book. Russwurm is co-editor along with the other figure I want to talk about, Samuel Cornish. They're co-editors of Freedom's Journal, which is the first newspaper published, edited and published by African Americans in the U.S. And Russwurm eventually sort of is left in charge of the paper on his own, and he is trying to sort of confront the question of what Black folks should do in the U.S. Like where do they belong, or do they belong, and how should they like kind of try to make their lives something different or something better than what it is at the moment. And Russwurm eventually basically gets tired of that struggle. He's exhausted with the idea of continuing to work to make the U.S. a place that's livable for Black people. And so Russwurm writes a newspaper editorial that says, we consider it a waste of words to talk of ever enjoying citizenship in this country. And eventually he decides to leave the US. He settles in Liberia and he never returns to the country. So I started with Russwurm because, at least with this project, I was interested in like, so what did he mean when he talked about citizenship? Like, what did that mean to
Right.
him? What did he feel like he was lacking? So Russwurm leaves the US, and then his former colleague, Samuel Cornish, still in New York, comes back into the newspaper editing business. And Cornish becomes the leading figure in Black publishing in the 1830s. He establishes a newspaper called The Colored American and writes extensively about the injustices Black Americans face in the US, the moments when they're denied the right to vote, moments when they're confronted with racist violence, the persistence of slavery in the South and the expansion of slavery in the South. All of these things are sort of wrapped up in his project of sort of pursuing racial justice within the US. And I think that the title there, so the title Freedom's Journal of the first Black newspaper is compelling in its own right, right? This is a voice for the cause of freedom. But I think Cornish's title that he chooses, The Colored American, that's making a similarly powerful but a much more sort of like subtle, I think, and complex argument. Essentially what Cornish is saying is, we are Americans. We are, and we are distinctive. We are people of color, and this is our home. This is our place. And so from the start, from the headline, the top line of all of these issues of the newspaper, Cornish is he's resisting, he's challenging the ideas of his former colleague, John Russwurm. Russwurm said Black folks can't be Americans, and Cornish is insisting, yes, we can. And for him, the newspaper is one of the ways that he does it.
And
And so,
Frederick Douglass was another one who said,
yeah,
don't even think about extradition.
yeah,
But you know, the interesting thing too is that there's these parallel movements of the Seneca Falls with
mm,
the abolitionist movement, and each sort of and this continues, I must say, into the 20th century
mm,
with, you know, because Jerry Ferraro ends up on the ticket as the nominee for the vice president. entirely because of Jesse Jackson's candidacy.
Mm.
I mean, that's really is what drove the Democrat. Having been there, and not for putting myself as ancient as Frederick Douglass, um, but having been there, that's exactly why. Because suddenly the party realized, hey, maybe we need to define we as more than white men.
Mm.
And so, because of Jesse Jackson's candidacy, Mondale calls a gathering in Minnesota. I was there among the women who were there uh, to decide on Jerry Ferraro.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the two have played off of each other, a lot. And so, this notion of voting gets
Yeah.
to be an important notion, do you not think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's a major point of conflict. One of the really unfortunate moments in this sort of um this connection between, or this intersection of Black
Mm-hmm.
politics and women's politics is the moment after emancipation, immediately after the Civil War. You get this conflict between people like Douglass and people like Susan B. Anthony and others who are clashing about who should have the right to vote. Should the 15th Amendment, which eventually confers the right to vote on Black men, should it be written in a way that includes women? Should essentially there are women arguing that white women should have the right to vote first,
Mm-hmm.
and Black men like Frederick Douglass arguing that Black men must have the right to vote first, and that they would then use that power to protect women and in a kind of like doing their manly duty. And it's there's no simple answer to this. To me, what I think what sticks out to me about that is like, you see the dedication of people to a cause. They want to produce some change. They want to secure something better for themselves and their lives. But the root of that is this sense that the government creates, that like rights are scarce. It's like there's only
Mm-hmm.
so much liberation to go around. There's only so much opportunity to go around. And so two different groups of people who have been marginalized and disempowered, they start fighting over who gets what, because the government creates the sense that's like there's only a little bit to go around. We'll only give one. We'll only make a little bit of change. We'll only give one group something beneficial. And so their investment in the right to vote, right? Douglass believed that everybody, men and women, should have the right to vote. White women abolitionists generally believed as well that Black and white Americans together, men and women, should have the right to vote.
The thing that I think is interesting is that the first breakthrough in terms of a non-white male president was a Black man. And we're still struggling with the notion of a woman. Not mad at either. I am impacted by both. But uh, in terms of getting through the door, some would argue that it's definitely color comes first, but ascending in power is very much gender related. I think that's
Yeah.
some truth to it.
Well,
And
they're both gonna operate as functional parts of a person's identity, and
mm-hmm.
there are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with the idea of a Black president. But for some of those people, the fact that the Black president was a man made it okay. But you hear and you see now the persistent discomfort with a potential president of color, and then also on top of that, the enduring feeling that people are asking like, oh, can a woman actually like handle the pressures of the presidency, and can she effectively negotiate with world leaders? There's still this feeling among a lot of people of women's incapacity, which is absurd.
Oh no, no, no. I mean, that was always I certainly an issue with me as a
Yeah.
first woman to be a mayor in this
Right.
city,
Yeah. I don't need to tell you about it.
and heaven forbid that they thought I would, deal with anything important like the major sports teams.
Right.
And
Right.
so, but at any rate, I knew that there was that tension. But it's also interesting to me in terms of, again, a collective fleshing out of what constitutes citizenship, which
Mm,
was never really addressed,
mhm,
understandably, because all of it was so radically new, so radically different.
mhm.
And and there was no precedence for it. And when you think also, for me, when I look at how important people like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Ulysses Grant became to the world. I'm not talking about for the United States, to the world. I
Mm,
mean, they could go places and the world would show up
mm,
because we were such a unique and hopeful profile to
mm,
the rest of the world. Um, and so, and here we are in 2024, still wrestling with what did it all mean and
mm.
just who are we, which is to some extent embodied in this campaign of let's make America great again. Let's go back to, and then we're never going back. I
Yeah,
mean, so it couldn't be more obvious the
yeah,
clash of
yeah,
ideologies.
yeah. And one of the things, my expertise is in the 19th century, but I have a lot of thoughts about the 21st century. But one of the things that I just think is compelling about those two slogans, um, one of them, "Make America Great Again," is suggesting reflection on the past and then a restoration of something that existed in the past, and the other is suggesting, oh, we should just move forward, we should move on from the past. But it's interesting to see how the people who advocate for those ideologies actually engage with history, right? The extent to which people who are saying "Make America Great Again" are also the same people who are suppressing and constraining what we talk about when we talk about the past. I think is really compelling, and I think that the any real and rigorous exploration of American history would demand that we think about how to move forward and continue to push beyond the histories of oppression and exclusion and marginalization that have defined the nation in the past. And so it's hard to reckon with the idea that people say they want to bring back the past when those folks don't seem to be thinking about what the past actually looked like,
Yeah,
uh,
I mean,
what it
it's
entailed.
who
Yeah,
gets to author history, you know?
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, so, but it's still something that we struggle with. We're still
yeah.
struggling with the notion of who constitutes, we the people, which is why your scholarship, I think, is so very important. You won, what is it, James Broussard uh, Book Award,
Right.
uh, because it was so utterly impactful. And you brought a whole new insight to it. And again, as I said, as someone who was born in a hospital called Freeman's and should know better than this, but I just always thought of it as in a very parochial terms
Hmm.
of what its impact may have been on my life or something
Hmm.
like that, as against how it had such uh, uh, a resonating impact on American life.
Hmm.
Um, Frederick Douglass, who do you think with who he had a close relationship or a decent relationship with Abraham Lincoln and then Ulysses Grant?
Hmm.
Who do you think he thought better of? Was it Ulysses Grant?
It's hard to say, I think in a lot of ways I think I would imagine that Douglas would have felt um like a lot of us do, like thoughtful observers of the past, that both of those men ended up in like really unfortunate circumstances. Lincoln, Douglas, I think, was deeply disappointed. I know Douglas was deeply disappointed by Lincoln's hesitancy to embrace emancipation during the Civil War, and then he was almost like overwhelmed by the significance of Lincoln's change, Lincoln's move toward the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Lincoln's eventual statements in favor of voting rights and broader civil rights for some Black people. I think Douglas loved that aspect of Lincoln, his evolution. And then, of course, Lincoln was unable to complete that evolution because his life was cut short. I think that Douglas admired a lot of what certainly a lot of Grant's military prowess and his ability to actually win on the battlefield the victory of freedom that had been represented in the Union military. And I think Douglas probably would have been really disappointed by Grant's inability to sort of manage the government in as effective of a way, and would have been deeply disappointed by I guess like the the failure of Grant to really reckon with, in a lot of ways, the hard truths of Reconstruction. But so much of that was Grant's administration being overwhelmed by problems of corruption and problems of internal conflict and strife. And so it's
Can you imagine trying to stand that up?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I just can't even imagine. It's
yeah,
hard enough making government work the way people agree it should work. Now you've got to make it work in a way they had never thought they. And
yeah,
even the people who bought into Reconstruction didn't really buy into it.
yeah.
I mean, what they were doing is they understood that if you now have these folks are emancipated, they're no longer just three-fifths human being for
Mm,
purposes of somebody else's congressional district or electoral votes. Now you actually have to count them as voters.
mm,
I mean, eventually, that's why the 15th Amendment was there to ensure that the Republicans didn't get overwhelmed by votes in the South.
mm,
It was very self-serving,
yeah.
and and did people? So I say all that to say, how could you not be guilty and be charged with corruption and
Mm,
everything else, trying to force down people's throats, which is
mm,
what it was. I mean, we even in the 20th century and the 21st century, we saw in the 21st century was the governor's name Northam in
mm,
Virginia. You know, a man who was a decent man who
mm,
thought it was okay to participate in blackface.
yeah.
I mean, those stereotypes, that mythology we've had a hard time shaking
Mm.
it.
Yeah,
And
yeah. It's interesting that the problem of Reconstruction really makes me think a little bit about some of what I've written about, which is like the difficulty, or like the gap, the distance between what the law says and the ways that people actually live their lives. And so like during
mhm.
Reconstruction, the problem is the law says African Americans are free, African Americans are citizens, and African American men have the right to vote, right? That's what the law says. But the effort to implement that, to make that align with the reality of Black life, especially in the South, is incredibly difficult. You know, Grant has to send in troops sometimes to ensure that Black men can vote, and other times just to make sure that Black men who have voted or have tried to vote are not killed, right? That's the difficulty of making life line up with the law. And that can work in the other way as well, like in favor of marginalized people. So in my work, one of the things that I think is fascinating is um, the US Constitution does not say that African Americans are citizens or are entitled to rights. But there are moments in the 1820s and 1830s in Pennsylvania, for instance, where African American men are allowed to vote. So up until 1838, free Black Pennsylvanian men can vote. And then after 1838, that law is removed. And so there's an interesting way in which the federal law says, you know, that's not actually, these folks don't have rights. But then on the state level, they might be able to practice some rights. And on the local level, they might even be able to have some like real robust political power, especially in smaller spaces where the population is minor, and they can become a more major part of that population. So there's always this kind of like, I don't know, there's a complexity to the ways that the law actually applies in people's lives, and it's interesting to think about the problems that can create, and also the ways that that might create opportunities.
The 65 Voting Rights Act, I mean, people were fighting then. People were getting lynched then
Mm,
just to be able to vote.
yeah,
And I mean, thank God for the 65 Voting Rights Act and what a difference it has made. But I mean, Grant had to fight the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, I've
mm,
learned these things about him more. I didn't know it
yeah,
until preparing for this series. And that in and of itself, you know, you have to give him point. That's why I was wondering if Lincoln Douglas thought better of, you know, Grant. And
yeah.
Douglas was just such an amazing man, which is why we're going to name this place DC Douglas Commonwealth, because he had the vision to support statehood then.
Mm,
He was
yeah,
just amazing. I
yeah,
mean, he was a force that was that was going to happen no matter where he was, in what body he was placed, and where, in what county he was placed. He
Yeah.
was just a force of nature, and he was going to happen. And some people are that, they're just a force of nature,
Yeah.
and he's extraordinary.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But you also speak of the tensions that existed among, I mean, which there always have been, among the intellectual leadership of the Black community.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, that happened then, and that continues to today, I guess. Maybe
Yeah.
less so, as power has been diffused more. People have been
Mm.
able to immerse more into the
Mm.
mainstream of the body politic.
Mm.
Um, but
Yeah.
it always existed. Um, you want to elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There's always, I think one of the biggest things is like a tension over tactics. So sometimes you get a tension over just like ideology, and the story of John Russwurm saying we should leave and Sam McCormick saying no, this is where we belong. That's like one of these
Mm-hmm.
moments where certain Black folks felt like there was nothing left for them in the US, and others felt like this is my home. I'm going to do everything I can to fight for it. And you can see that, Douglass gets involved in some of those conflicts as well, up to in the 1850s and up to, even during the Civil War. Douglass is insisting that Black men should enlist, should sign up and risk their lives to fight in the U.S. military. And he thinks that that's going to be transformative, that putting on the military uniform is going to be the path for Black people to secure rights. But so other folks we know are saying, why would I sign up and risk my life for this country that's never done anything for me? What do you think I'm doing? And one of the ways that I think about this with my students is, um, there are these famous posters that were tacked up on walls in northern cities that were trying to call out Black men to join the military, and the posters are huge, and they shout. It's like big capital letters, "Men of color to arms." And one of the things I talk with my students about, I ask them, like, what does it mean that this poster is shouting? Like, why is this so loud? And what it means is that there were some people, like the crafters of the posters, who were really enthusiastic about Black military service. And then there were other people who were being shouted at, who really need to be encouraged, really need to be pushed or like dragged into the military. So like the existence of that object shows you that there was this tension among Black Americans, and it really kind of, it opens up Black communities beyond people like Douglass, right? Douglass wasn't producing those kinds of posters to talk to other elite, educated, uh, prominent abolitionist men. He was producing them to talk to regular Black folks. And somewhere in those communities of regular Black folks, we can imagine people in a tavern, people in a church, people in a house debating, like, do I actually want to sign up to serve this government? Like, why? What would it do for me? And I don't know. That's one of the things that's remarkable is not just the choice, the willingness of Black men to do that, but the the conversations we can imagine, the debates we
Yeah.
can imagine about sort of the roots of those choices.
And don't you think it made the difference? I mean, it should not have had to have occurred for it to be a
Yeah.
big difference, but it did, don't
So
you think?
I think numerically, African American soldiers made a major difference. I think that there are moments when we can
Yeah.
see, tracking them through their military service, that just as regiments they made a difference. And I think ideologically, intellectually, it was transformative. To go back to Lincoln, the moment before he's assassinated, when he says, I'm interested in extending the right to vote to certain Black men, especially those who are educated and those who have served in the military. He is conceptualizing racial justice as, in part, as an exchange for military service. And so in that sense, and this is not to say like other people were wrong, but Douglass was correct to anticipate that there was political value to Black military service. Um, so
I
absolutely.
mean, and Douglas was obsessed with uh, imagery also.
Mm.
The,
Yeah.
I mean, in his own constantly having himself photographed,
Hmm.
his three autobiographies.
Yeah.
I mean, his obsession with the
Yeah.
English language and his ability to present. And without a doubt, if you live in a place, I mean, as it is with, okay, gender bias. I mean,
Mm.
if people walk in, are functioning in a world that where there's the horrific biases, doesn't that have a transformative effect to see this empowered,
Yeah.
noble, valiant Black man?
Yeah. Yeah. And absolutely. And that's what I was going to say is like, Douglass really believed in photography and portraits as a way to transform the ways um, Americans thought about Black people. And it was also, I think Douglass liked looking at himself. He liked being seen. And I think thinking about portraits of Douglass really makes me think about the really significant and wonderful numbers of portraits we have of Black men in uniform, men who are not really known at all beyond what we know about their military service record. But I think that it was the same thing, that they thought this is a statement about who I am as an American, and also like I look good. Like, look at me
Yeah,
in this suit, right? I think that's meaningful. Like, I love that kind of analysis. Like, let's think about the politics of this portrait, but also like, what does this mean personally to this man? And you'll see images of men on their own with their weapons. You'll see images of regiments lined up, making stern faces, showing who they are and their readiness to fight. You'll see images of two men, brothers, lined up next to each other, embracing. And there are images, really wonderful photos of Black families, a man in uniform, a woman and children in their nice clothing. Like that was all of that was both like outwardly meaningful, like a message to the country, but also like let's preserve a picture of ourselves and our beauty in this moment.
definitely internalized. And again, something that I hadn't thought about as much too. I admit my own ignorance is that with the launching of the African American Civil War Museum, which is where we'll have our last event, that was also the beginning of to some level of a not very a middle class. I mean, there were
Mm.
people. There were 200,000 men about who actually had cash, who
Yeah.
were no, we come from a community that's been enslaved,
Mm.
and now you have people who have cash who actually help start schools,
Mm.
so forth. I mean, to have been so stripped of your dignity and your any agency, and now to have some dignity and some agency. I mean, when you think about the numbers, it had to have been those soldiers in the Civil War more than any
Mm.
subset of the African American community, at least in the 19th century. Wouldn't you say?
Mm. So, it's hard to say like who is occupying the middle class or who is really contributing, but I do think that there's, to me, that's one of the things that's so cool about emancipation, is just thinking about it materially. Like Black folks made money and held money in large numbers
Mm-hmm.
for the first time, right? They were able to legally work for wages and possess it. They were able to occupy territory on their own right and work for themselves. Like that is, and thinking about that as just like a really kind of mundane thing. Like I'm going to continue working in agriculture, but I'm going to do it to support myself and my family. Mundane, but profoundly transformative, right? And a reflection of how radically different life was after emancipation than it had been before. I think it's um, you read records from the period, and Black folks are asked, what does freedom mean to you? And they say, oh, it's the right to turn and till the land in my own interest, right? They don't many of them aren't thinking, okay, I want to live radically different than what I had been, but they recognize that the simple change of doing the same work for oneself is a radical
Yeah,
change, even if the day-to-day content of their lives isn't different. And I think that it's that, to me, that's a way to see just like how um almost like how all consuming slavery was, right?
Yeah,
The problem was not like I'm doing agricultural work. The problem was I cannot determine the meaning of my work. I cannot benefit from the labor that I put out into the world. And I think that so just that um simple change of like who do you work for was
yourself.
yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, the no agency. I
Yeah.
mean, I think it's difficult to define how horrible an institution it was. And
Yeah.
there's a reason when the Nazis decided to establish the Holocaust, they knew where to go and find the template and came here and studied slavery in America. I
Mm.
mean, 247 years of it.
Yeah.
Are you
Yeah.
surprised, if I may ask, sort of as a last question, that this transformative moment in American history had such a profound impact and influence for the nation's capital, where you live right next, where you live here? Yeah, that's right.
Uh I think I wouldn't say it's surprising, and I think I'm thinking about the work of colleagues who have explored the ways that DC sort of operated in this period of in this era of emancipation during the Civil War. It almost makes perfect sense that DC was so transformed because one of the things that happens during the Civil War is that Black folks kind of running away from slavery, seeking new lives through the US military or alongside the US government, they kind of move toward spaces of power. And so in the Deep South, you see Black Americans moving toward contraband camps, military establishments that are set up in, Mississippi, Alabama, across the South where the US Army is moving. I think that the same impulse animated Black migration in this area, in which Black people see that's where the government is. I'm going to go there, and I'm going to
Mhm.
make claims on what I deserve. And so, DC changes the face in some ways of DC changes, the meaning of DC changes because the government becomes during the Civil War, it becomes an institution that is listening to and is designed to respond to the needs and interests of Black Americans. And so Black Americans push their way in and they demand from the government. And that's part of
Yeah,
what yeah makes the district what it is.
yeah. And of course, when Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, I think they had 5 employees. And so there are a lot of
Yeah.
political players
Yeah.
say, let's
You
go
need
back
a
to
lot of
that.
government to wage
Yeah.
a war. Yeah.
But you needed a real more robust federal presence to
Yeah.
prosecute the Civil War and
Yeah.
then to stand up Reconstruction. That
Yeah.
that's a lot of operations going on.
Mhm.
So,
Absolutely.
well, you bring such extraordinary insights and such a unique scholarship uh, to this moment in American history. Um, and it's, we at IPPH can't thank you enough, one, for participating in our moment of talking about providential presidency of Abraham Lincoln, but now I really appreciate how this was such an extraordinary moment in American history. And I don't think anyone's done a better job of highlighting the significance of this moment than have you. So it's a real
Appreciate it.
honor to have you with us.
Yeah, I was really glad to be here. Thanks for the time.
Well, thank you.
All
Really
right.
appreciate it.